Hello, my name is Gene, and I'll be your host as we walk through time and talk about the sea peoples. Now, when you think of sea peoples, do you think of something like the arch enemy of the Doctor Who character, the sea devils, a prehistoric humanoid creature coming out of the water, or something more like the creature from the Black Lagoon, or perhaps pirates? Well, what we have are a band of people, tribes, are probably the best way to think of them, who were hired by different nations as a military force. At least that's what it appears to be from all the textual data and primary sources, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But here, for instance, on the right, you'll see the image of the actual inscriptions at the mortuary temple of Egyptian Pharaoh Ramesses III. And you'll see the line drawing on the left side. It shows kind of the details. Now, here's a part of that that's been colored like it probably would have been back in the old days when the New Kingdom Egyptian Empire was really rolling. Here's another look at the mortuary temple outside. It shows Ramesses III, dominating against his enemies, these sea peoples. But who were they? Were they a single people? Were they a confederation of allies that were just bent on destruction, pillaging and plundering as they went along the Mediterranean coastlines? Were they a band of hired mercenaries, soldiers for hire? Or were they a migratory people that were just merely looking for a new home? Or, as some have suggested, were they the first truly international joint military venture whose design and goal was to defeat an enemy? Well, we will look at that a little bit here in a second, but let's look at those primary sources I mentioned earlier. Here's the Biblos obelisk. Now, it's also known as the Abishmu obelisk because that was the name of the king who had commissioned it and it was dedicated to. The Marna letters. These were cuneiform letters that would have been correspondence, mostly political, diplomatic correspondence that would have went back and forth between vassal city-state governments and the empires in charge of them, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the others. Well, these letters, and the majority of these letters were, these diplomatic things from the vassal states over to the capital, like sending a letter to Washington, and they were complaining about these invaders, these sea peoples from the north. Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu has some of the greatest information that we have ever gotten about the sea peoples. But again, we cannot believe all that because, again, a lot of that was propaganda. It was Ramesses III kind of tooting his own horn how great he was. Now, here's another item that has just recently become on public display. As you see here, it was discovered in the 1920s, but it has not been on public display until it was loaned to the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles in 2018. It came from the city of Garab, and it was in a tomb. It was the only item in the tomb. It was a model of what appears to be a 50-oared Mycenaean-style sailing vessel, but it also had a cart. Some academics believe the cart would have been something that they would have pulled the vessel on the land with, as in like a military parade, or as a part of a procession for a great king coming in. But it also speaks of how the sea people tribes had adopted and adapted to the technology of the times with the Mycenaean-style ships. These would have been a 50-oar ship, according to Dr. Shelley Waxman from Texas A&M, who was working with the J. Paul Getty Museum and the Petrie Museum over in France to get this item into LA. And then we have the World War Zero theory. Now, Eberhard Zenger, who is a geoarchaeologist and the head of the Leeuwen Studies Foundation in Switzerland has conjectured that the battles between the Luwian, this would have been the early Libyan, what we call Libya today, but they would have shared a border just west of the Nile River with Egypt. They had hired, according to some sources, they had hired the Sea People tribes, the different ones, the Peliset, the Tajerkers, the Eshwans, the Sherdans, the Luka, all these various tribes had been hired by the king of Libya to do battle with Egypt. Or, as Ebert Zanger believes, this was World War Zero. This was, World War One, World War Two in the early 20th and mid 20th century would have been international battles against many nations. Several nations on one side, the Allies against the axis of evil, so to speak. And this instance would have been similar. The Egyptians and the Hittites would have been the baddies, according to the Libyans, and according to the Egyptians and the Hittites, they were the good guys. Everybody, its perspectives. Anyway, this is Ebert Zanger's theory, and I am kind of inclined to at least believe that this is a possibility. Although there's only 5 sources, I count 6 and 7 with the Goldbard model cart and with some DNA testing that was recently done in 2016, 17, 18, and 19 on some skeletons found in the Levant. What would have been the Levant area, it's modern day Lebanon. So, who's to say? All we know is that the Sea People, where they came from, remains a mystery. Where they went, now some believe that they kind of just blended in and they became part of the people, and that's what that DNA testing showed. In fact, that's the Feldman and Masters there. If you look at the secondary source I use, right below D'Amato and above Garnett there, Garnett's talking about the model there, as well as McCall does, and so does Shelley Weckerman. But the DNA testing kind of showed some European skeleton remains dating to the early Iron Age that were kind of shouldn't have been there, so maybe. But then again, we don't know enough, and that's why it's so intriguing, and that's why it remains one of those mysteries of history right now. And it's helped along by, in this digital age, there are a lot of character-driven role-playing games where you get to be, the Sea Peoples or different, Marinatep or Ramesses III. So it keeps these kind of ancient peoples and ancient questions alive in the minds of everyone. Who knows what archaeological digs we'll find in the future. Thank you. Hope you've enjoyed this. For a lot more information, you can go to any of these sources here, and they'll be able to show you a lot more information than I can give you in just a short recording. But hopefully I've given you enough information to go on so you can get an idea of who the Sea Peoples were. And they weren't just marauders. I mean, some of the sources they make it sound like they're just a vicious people, but they were people that were trying to soldiers for hire. But at some point there were droughts, there were earthquakes in the region, there was political instability, there was infighting in some of these kingdoms. Most of the resources I read, especially the early resources after Gaston Maspero's mid 1800s discovery of the Sea People, so to speak. Well, most of those sources talk about a time of peace and prosperity here in the late Bronze Age, when in fact it seems like there was a lot of internal strife. There was a lot of political battles. The Hittites and Egyptians had an uneasy truce, but that had been because of the Battle of Kadesh in the 1200 BCEs. And both sides claimed victory, but yet both sides kind of had an uneasy peace treaty. So these Sea People tribes like the Luka would have been hired. The Sherdans would have been pressed into service. So they may have fought for the Libyans, but they may have also fought for the Egyptians. And so It would be like saying the United States has regular military, and then they also have little bands of vigilante kind of military forces, sort of like Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders in the Philippines. In San Juan Hill, they were not. They were kind of military, but not kind of military. So the Sea Peoples could have been like this. They could have been a people that were just very good at their jobs. They adapted. They learned new technologies from the different empires. They made their way from Crete, made their way down to Manoa, Mycenae, and then they come over into the eastern Mediterranean seaboard. And they ran into some trouble with the Hittites and especially the Egyptians. But the Egyptians like to proclaim how they won, but according to the Egyptians, they never lost a battle. And I've not met many militaries in the course of history that can claim that they've never lost one. Well, they can claim it, but again, facts wear out. So hopefully, if you enjoyed this, give us a like or give us a comment below. I'm sure there's things I missed, but hopefully, you've learned something. Thank you.